All right. Well, then let's go ahead and get started. Welcome again, everyone, to our webinar here. Uh, whoops, Measure smarter, not more. So, understanding assessment types, uses, and common misuses. My name is Jesse Steif. I am a literacy content and implementation manager here at the Lastinger Center, and my background is in elementary education and school psychology. And so, assessment and assessment-driven instruction is a topic that is near and dear to my heart, and maybe one of the sort of lesser discussed domains here as everyone is on their journey to towards more evidence-based practices in their practice. So let's talk about today's goals here. What are we going to leave here with? To understand the types of assessment that are out there, and what each one of them measures and what assessment questions they can answer. One of the next goal is to clarify common misconceptions about how different assessments are used. There is We are big on this concept of explicit instruction here at the Lastinger Center and in evidence-based practice. And one of the main levers to pull in explicit instruction is to use examples and non-examples of concepts. And so I always find it helpful, and participants always find it helpful when we talk about a concept and how it applies, but then also how it does not apply. So we'll emphasize also some common assessment mistakes, and then what to do sort of instead. Uh, we're going to connect the assessment types with the types of instructional decisions that they support, and then provide you with some prompts and ways to think about how to apply this assessment information to your assessment ecosystem. And that's a term that I sort of like here because today, maybe more than ever in 2026, we are awash in this sort of sea of data. Sometimes I think about a thick jungle full of weeds and trees and leaves and branches, and our job here as educators is to sort of hack and slash our way through and find out, to try to determine what is usable information versus what is information that we can sort of ignore, or information that is maybe applied or not applied in the correct context. We have universal screeners, we have diagnostic assessments, we have progress monitoring probes, end of unit tests, state exams. We have so much data at our fingertips, um, and what is needed is like this is a useful framework or heuristic to help us understand and put this data into the right box or the right frame of thinking. Because each type of assessment data is really designed to answer different questions. And we don't want to try to use one piece of data to answer a question that it wasn't actually designed to answer. Um, and we also want to say at the outset here that there is no such thing as a single assessment that can answer every question that you need, about your students or about your school systems or your grade levels, if we have leaders here in the audience today, or who are watching after the fact. Um, so we do need, from a leadership perspective and from a teacher perspective, we do need a fair amount of data, at our fingertips to help drive instruction and improve student outcomes. But there absolutely does come a point, particularly now when we have data reports that are 50 pages long or 30 pages long, where we may be either over assessing students or generating more data than we know certainly what to do with. So today we're going to try to kind of cut through some of the noise, and try to find where the signal is in the noise here by talking about these assessment types and the questions that each one is built to answer. So, um, when we're talking with schools, about and who are dealing with more data than they know what to do with. Um, you know, we get to the point where teachers or leaders are kind of looking at their pages and pages of data reports and kind of wondering what they can do with it. Um, and looking at their scores and kind of wondering what they can glean from that. And we would like to encourage folks to flip a mode of thinking and say instead of looking at our scores first and saying, okay, well, what can we glean from this? We want to ask, what question do I actually need to answer? And then using that question to to guide you to look at all of your different data sources. Uh, so first we need to figure out what do I need to know about an individual student, about a tier two intervention group, about a particular classroom at in a grade level, about a particular grade level, or a particular school. And once you've kind of articulated that question to serve whatever purposes that you need, then you want to figure out, okay, well, what action will I take when I find out the information, or when we sort of boil it down and answer it? Is this going to lead to a change in my intervention group? Is this going to lead to I need to am I or am I not going to reteach a particular lesson? From a leadership perspective, can I identify a certain percentage of students who are falling below benchmark that would necessitate us to have to take a look at what's going on in tier one instruction and make some tough changes to our curriculum and instruction. So we want to identify those decision points and then look at which data answers it, and then take action. So we're sort of flipping the way that we think about it, and starting with the question in mind, deciding on what action you're going to take, then diving into your data. So let's take a look at the four types of assessments and four kind of domains of questions that they can answer. And we'll start with screening assessments. Screening assessments are created um, to answer the question, which students are at risk for future reading failure, or who are actively struggling in reading now and need additional intervention. Uh, and that's the question from a specific student standpoint. If we have leaders in the audience here, or even and classroom teachers, screening data, when we aggregate it and we look at whole classrooms and grade levels and schools, and we look at the proportion of students who are falling below a benchmark and indicating that they need intervention, it tells us a lot about how effective my core tier one instruction is. So a big job of a literacy leadership team or a school-based leadership team, that we call them lots of different things throughout the state, is to is to look at your screening data and use that to determine, well, are there systemic changes that need to happen here, that are causing this high level of risk in our students who are at risk for future reading failure. We'll talk more about this concept of risk when we get in more depth about into screeners. We have diagnostic assessments. Um, a diagnostic assessment is meant to answer the question of what specific skills um, do students need instruction or intervention in. Uh, then there is progress monitoring assessments, which are our tools that help us understand how students are responding to instruction or intervention over time. They have specific characteristics that make them useful for answering that question. And then we have outcome or summative assessments. And these are our standards-based end of unit or end of year assessments that that give us a high level picture of whether or not students have mastered the standards that we've taught towards. So we're going to spend most of the time talking about each one of these individual assessment types. There are some more specifics about their uses and their maybe misuses or mistakes that we make when interpreting them. And we'll do some multiple choice activities here as well, where you can put your answer in the chat. All right, so first let's jump into screening assessments here. Um, again, as I mentioned, screening assessments should be brief, and they should sort of sort students into who is at risk for reading difficulties and needs additional support to sort of lower that risk. And again, it's also a systems level risk indicator, meaning is there some is are there is there something about the tier one instruction that is causing more students than need be to fall below benchmark. So um, I want to talk a little bit more about this concept of risk and what screeners actually do. So screeners star reading, other computer adaptive tests like MAP and iReady, or curriculum-based measures like DIBELS, oral reading fluency, or Acadian's oral reading fluency. I think about them as when I'm thinking about early literacy, I think about them as like the closest thing we have to a crystal ball to predict where a student is headed if they are a young student. Oftentimes, it's really hard to know, in the absence of screening data, to know if when a student's entering kindergarten or first grade or even second grade, whether they are on track to, say, meet standards by the end of third grade. And screening assessments can do that really, really, really well because of how they're created. They have a property to them called predictive validity, meaning that we know if you fall above or below a certain cut point, that most students who are scoring in that range either do or do not go on to fail at, an end of year outcome measure. So when we look at something like star reading or fast in K2, we know that it has really, really strong predictive validity for third grade reading outcomes. We know pretty well based on how you score in kindergarten or first grade, how on track or off track you are to be a proficient reader by the end of third grade. Now, that doesn't mean that you are doomed to that if you are at risk in kindergarten or first grade. It's far from that. Actually, it's the exact opposite. You are never sort of doomed to be a non-proficient reader in third grade, but it shows us where a student's trajectory is headed if we don't provide intervention. And of course, effective intervention can be life-changing, can absolutely affect a student's trajectory, regardless of when we provide it. But intervention is most effective in those primary K2 years. So risk in screening doesn't mean that a student has, a disability. It just means that based on their current performance, they're unlikely to meet later reading benchmarks without additional support. Uh, and again, like that's the whole point of of using the term risk, is that risk can be reduced. If I am at risk for hypertension and I have high blood pressure, I can take action by lowering the amount of salt that I eat, and and eating more kale in my diet. And I can reduce my risk for future hypertension, just like we can reduce risk for literacy difficulties. Um, and so that concept of risk also applies to our tier one. Uh, so we know that when, say, 80% of students in a class or in a grade level or at a school are meeting benchmark, our tier one instruction is healthy, and it's meeting the needs of most students. But when fewer than that proportion of students are, um, the instructional system itself is at risk. And the fix for that is strengthening tier one core instruction. Um, it's so we always want to look at curriculum and instruction first before suspecting that it's a student level difficulty, um, because the vast majority of students don't have a disability. Some of them absolutely do, and there will always be a need for specially designed instruction and tier two and tier three intervention. But we know that the vast majority of students don't need or shouldn't need intensive intervention and specially designed instruction. So I sort of think about screening data as a mirror for instruction. If kids are not, or if students aren't climbing those performance bands and raising their achievement levels, we look at curriculum, instruction, and implementation, and not just jump right into assuming something is wrong with the student. So they are meant to answer the questions of which of my students need intervention, and is our tier one instruction working for most students? So let's talk about some common screening mistakes. Uh, the first one is using multiple screeners. And that can cause a couple of issues. So I want to be clear here where we're talking about two screeners that measure reading the exact same way, like two computer adaptive tests. That's what that acronym stands for, CAT, Computer Adaptive Test. Um, using two computer adaptive tests doesn't actually improve the accuracy with which we are identifying students who are at risk. It actually reduces accuracy. Um, and um, because you might have one screener that says where a student scores in, say, the 20th percentile, and maybe the other screener may indicate the student is scoring slightly above where that cut score for where you would provide tier two or tier three intervention. And what do you do when you have um, what do you do when you have that scenario? It doesn't mean that one is right or one is wrong, but it has to do with how that computer adaptive test actually measures student reading. Um, and whereas if you are pairing something like a computer adaptive test that measures overall reading skills, with a little bit of vocabulary, a little bit of phonics, a little bit of oral language, a little bit of comprehension, with something like an oral reading fluency test, where a student has 1 minute to read a text out loud, and we measure their words correct per minute, which can tell us a ton about how a student is reading. That actually can improve identification of students who are at risk, particularly in the elementary grades. The next one is using screeners to identify exactly what to teach. There's no such thing as a screening assessment that will tell you everything that you need to know about what a student needs for tier one instruction and for small group intervention. Screeners vary in terms of the level of detail that they provide to you, but there is no such thing as a screener that will tell you, like, specifically enough exactly what you need to know in order to instruct them the next day. That's just not what a screener was made to do. It's very challenging to figure out all of the granular sort of small specific skills that students need from a computer adaptive test where they're answering multiple choice questions, and no two student is really getting the same set of questions. It's very challenging to group students based on screening data. And so the primary question again is that it can answer is who needs intervention, not necessarily what or everything that they need in terms of their intervention. Um, we can certain, the next one is related, forming small groups based only on screening. Um, Screening will tell us who may need in the elementary grades. Screening will tell us who needs small group, tier two and tier three intervention. But again, just not precise enough by themselves for, to form those particular groups. We need other pieces of data for that. And the other one is specific to English language learners. Sometimes we see uh, students in districts where we may delay or we don't screen students because depending on their English language learner status. Um, but research would indicate that that is not that's not a practice that we want to engage in. We want to screen every student. The term is universal screening. Every student gets screened. Um, and because the same risk indicators apply to English language learners as for English speaking students. And when we say risk indicators, we mean difficulties in key skills that we know to be very important for reading proficiency. On the early learning side, it's things like their level of their skills in phonological awareness, letter sound identification, segmenting and blending sounds, decoding words, their reading rate. As students get older, it's their oral, more and more of oral language proficiency comes to becomes much more important. Uh, that's which is not to say that oral language proficiency isn't important in the early language years or in the early learning years. Of course it is, but a greater it's word reading skills are actually a bigger indicator um, of risk in the early grades, just because most kids are learning how to read, in K2, and students' oral language in the later years becomes a bigger factor in their reading comprehension. So we want to screen all students regardless of whether they're a student with a disability or a English language learner, or or anyone else. All right. So we have a couple of these pause and predict questions built in throughout the session. So these are some multiple choice questions. So we're gonna take a look at a question. I'll show you A, B, C, or D, and then in the chat, I'd like you to put your answer. If you're watching this after the fact, go ahead and pause it here and think and come up with your answer. So we have a fictional district here that has a district assessment team or a school assessment team. They're planning next year's reading screening systems and talking about what assessments they're going to use and maybe what assessments they're going to get rid of, what assessments they may add. Currently, they use two computer adaptive screeners, beginning, middle, and end of the year, that will identify students as at risk the same, that will identify the same students about 75% of the time. So there are differences in how these two computer adaptive screeners measure students, and that result in differences in how they score and their percentile rank. And it's leading to situations where teachers feel uncertain about how to act when the results conflict. What do we think the committee should recommend? There's a little overlap there. A, keep both screeners and develop additional rules for resolving conflicts when screener A says, "Yep, we're at risk. We're in the 20th percentile," and B says, "No, we're not at risk. We're in the, say, 40th percentile, and we've identified as like the 35th percentile as the risk line." Or we can keep both, but reduce the number of screenings to twice a year instead of three times. We can adopt one screener and then use diagnostics to guide instruction, or we can add a third screener to break ties. So go ahead and take a moment. Oop, that took my slides away here. All right. The answer, C, adopt one screener and use diagnostics to then guide instruction. So answer choice A, uh, two two computer adaptive test screeners will result in less accuracy and more false positives and more false negatives. By false positives, we mean we have actually identified a student as at risk, but they actually don't need intervention. Maybe this is a student who kind of blew through the test, but is actually a proficient reader. Um, or this is a student who had some small issues, but actually, all things considered, even without intervention, would go on to be a proficient reader at the end of the year, and more false negatives, which are not so great when in a with a screener, meaning we've identified a student as not at risk, as having as being on track to reading proficiency, but they're actually not. They're struggling. One of the most common cases of false negatives happens for students who have who have word reading difficulties, but really strong kind of oral language comprehension. And so on a computer adaptive test, they may score in, say, like the 40th or the 50th percentile, because they can sort of glean enough meaning from the text, despite reading actually pretty inaccurately. Maybe they're reading like 75, 80% of the words correct. Um, and they have real reading issues, but they have strong enough oral language that they can kind of get the gist of a passage and pass with an average score a test of reading comprehension. Screening twice a year instead of three times a year with two screeners is still gonna be redundant. And adding a third screener would compound the problem, would increase the number of false positives and negatives and not solve it. Right. So that brings us to diagnostic assessments. And the first thing here, to set some context, when we use the term diagnostic, um, we're not talking about diagnosing a disability like a specific learning disability or dyslexia or something like that. When we think about like a medical diagnostic test, like a blood test, it says, yes, you have the blood markers for this disability, or you don't have the blood markers for this disability. That's not what we're talking about here with diagnostic assessments. We are diagnosing skill gaps or specific skills that students have or do not have, that may need instruction. So, what a diagnostic assessment does is we would administer diagnostic assessments to students who are found to be at risk on screeners. We don't give diagnostic assessments to every student like we screen every student. We just reserve the diagnostics for students who need intervention. Uh, and to figure out kind of what they need that intervention in. Why are they, what skills do we need instruction in? Um, so there are a lot of types of diagnostic assessments out there, including things like phonics surveys that are able to assess specific decoding or phonics skills that students do and do not have. Spelling inventories, where we have students spell a series of words and do some good error analysis to figure out what phonics skills they can and can't spell. When we look at students reading aloud, and we do some error analysis on that, that's a diagnostic. Listening to a student read out loud is a really wonderful driver of instruction. We can kind of see how they read and what types of errors they make. Um, there is and those are more on the foundational skills side of phonics and spelling and reading fluency. On the language side, on the more comprehension oriented side, um, we have there aren't as many. There are some new ones that are like just starting to come out in the last maybe year or 2 years. There's one, the Acadience Comprehension, Fluency, and Oral Language Diagnostic Assessment that will let you understand how your students understand, for example, narrative language and text structures, their ability to make inferences, their vocabulary, and a wide variety of other comprehension skills. It's a bit of a longer test, and so we don't want to give it to everyone, and it is free and open source available. Uh, and we'll also get into specific intervention placement tests here in just a moment. But just to we do also consider these intervention placement tests to be diagnostic. So we're not in we don't endorse any particular curricula or program, but many good evidence-based intervention programs will have students take a test in order to place them in a lesson within the lesson sequence. So some of the ones that are not like computer adaptive interventions that are more teacher directed and paper we'll have students read words and read passages, and we'll say, okay, you have the skills that we usually teach in lessons 1 through 50. So we're not gonna reteach those to you. You can decode CVC words with short vowels. You kind of understand a lot about early decoding instruction. So we're gonna put you into lesson 51 here, and that is considered a diagnostic observation assessment because it uh, it'll tell you the question, it'll answer the question, what does this student need for instruction right here, right now? Uh, so the questions, what skills has the student mastered? What are our next instructional targets? And diagnostic assessments are really where we want to look after screening to form our small groups for in intervention. We want to group students who have similar instructional needs when we're talking about tier two or tier three intervention. And the best way to do that is to provide everyone who's at risk and needs intervention diagnostic assessments and look at students who have similar profiles of strengths and weaknesses. And they will likely be students who would benefit from the same types of instruction. So we just have an example here. This is a small portion of a comprehensive phonics survey. If you're joining us and you're from a secondary grade, uh, then and you may not be familiar with a phonics survey. Um, this is just one small piece of a broader one. And you can see that we have students read CCVC words. We were measuring their ability to recognize consonant digraphs in initial and final positions, reading words with Y as a final vowel and open syllable words. So diagnostic assessments get very specific about the types of phonics patterns, or a phonics diagnostic get very specific about the types of phonics patterns that students need. Similarly, spelling inventories get very specific about the types of spelling instruction that students need, and so on. So some diagnostic mistakes that we see happening often, maybe a little less now, but as opposed to a couple of years ago, this first one, um, using text levels as diagnostic assessments. So I'm trained in elementary education. I was a second and fifth grade teacher, um, and a big part of my training, close to 30 years ago, was we want to find a student's reading level on level A through Z. Uh, and we know that and I was trained that we then put students in those levels of books for their instruction because those levels of books contain the skills that the student needs because they placed into that level of text. We know now that is off base. Um, there's a ton more complexity and nuance to these concepts of instructional level and independent and frustrational level. But we don't want to get in this habit of um, labeling a student as a particular level of text. A level K refers to the level of difficulty of a single book, not to the skills of a student. Same thing with a Lexile. You have a Lexile of 1100. That just refers to a text, not the capability of what a student is able to read. Um, Books within a particular level or books within a particular lexile range actually vary really widely in terms of kids' ability to read them. So I might assess a student at quote unquote at a level K, but if they are reading a book at an L, an M, an N, or an O that they are interested in or they have some background knowledge on, there's nothing in the research that would indicate they're not capable of that. So students do not have one instructional level as in terms of these letter levels or lexiles. It's much more complex than that, and we don't want to be in the business of holding students to texts that are at their level. Uh, Treating summative scores or outcome assessments as diagnostic. So looking at an end of unit comprehension test, a 10 question multiple choice, um, or another kind of summative test are, they measure standards, and some of them measure standards mastery really well. But they don't tell us why a student did or a student did not master a standard. If you answer a multiple question choice, if you answer a multiple choice question incorrectly on the computer, that measures a certain standard, we do know we know pretty well that you haven't mastered that standard, but there are all kinds of reasons why students answer those questions incorrectly. Maybe they couldn't read the question well, accurately enough, or the answer choices accurately enough to actually answer the question correctly. Maybe there's a word or two or three within the question or within the passage that a student didn't know the definition of. And so it's more of a vocabulary issue rather than a, author's perspective or any other standard. So we don't want to stop with we don't want to take a summative assessment, a standards-based assessment, and then jump directly to providing intervention in that specific standard without diving deeper into why they may be struggling. Uh, we don't want to administer diagnostics to all students. They can be very, very time intensive. Single diagnostic assessments can take anywhere between 5 to 15, sometimes 30 minutes. And so that it's just prohibitively long and expensive to do for every student. So this is just for students who are at risk and need intervention, and we need to know more. Uh, and on that same subject, um, if you are in a district that has specific interventions that you are using for say second grade students who are at risk, we know that we have these two interventions to choose from. Both of those interventions have placement tests. You likely do not need to do a full diagnostic assessment because that placement test is the diagnostic. It'll tell you where to start in that intervention. And there's no need to spend additional time assessing a student and likely not using that information. Time is always of the essence when it comes to students who are at risk and need intervention. We need to assess as little as possible, and only as much as necessary to drive our instruction. So, we have our next pause and predict. Mr. Lee's third graders just finished their winter screening, and 10 of his 25 were flagged as at risk and in need of intervention. They scored below, just saying, for example, below the 30th percentile, when the 30th percentile and below is the kind of our tier two and tier three criteria. So he pulls their guided reading levels, their end of unit assessment scores, and plans to administer a phonics diagnostic, because a lot of third graders do struggle in reading because they still can't read accurately and fluently enough. So he's going to administer them to the whole class next week to get a complete picture before moving into the grouping. What's the problem here? We have levels in unit tests aren't diagnostic, only the at-risk students need a diagnostic. B, he should add a second screener before diagnosing just to be sure. C, he should skip the diagnostic and group by his screening scores because that's going to take too much time. Or D, he should diagnose the whole class to compare at-risk students to the peers to see if everyone has an issue with decoding. All right, and our answer was A. Um, we should use additional what I would do if I were in Mr. Lee's class, I would skip the reading levels. I would, of course, we would want to collect that unit test data to figure out how we need to sort of drive our tier one instruction. Um, and only administer diagnostics to the student to those 10 students who were at risk. Uh, Hopefully he has some additional assistance from a reading coach, an interventionist, a school psychologist to help kind of shoulder the load of that. So again, adding a second screener is not going to help drive the intervention. Screening scores alone, again, don't determine group members. They determine that those students may need small group intervention, but not what intervention they need and how to group them. And then we don't need to diagnose to administer diagnostics to everyone, just the students who are at risk. All right, so let's talk about progress monitoring here. So when we talk about progress monitoring assessments, there's kind of two categories of how we monitor students' progress over time. Uh, we have something called general outcome measures. So these are, you might be familiar with general outcome measures if you have administered a DIBELS or an Acadian's oral reading fluency, phoneme segmentation fluency, nonsense word fluency. I mean, word reading fluency, there's lots of them, and generally they are all free and downloadable. And what they do is they assess overall growth in reading in response to intervention. So they are sort of these regular temperature checks to that indicate to us whether or not our intervention is working and or how effectively it's working. You know, what is a student's rate of progress? Are they making up those missing skills? Are we changing their trajectory? Are we changing their path and moving it from, oh boy, we're this student is really in trouble for this end of year test to the student is lessening and lessening their risk for that for issues on an end of year assessment. And then the other type of progress monitoring would are known as mastery measures, which are typically curriculum specific and built into structured interventions at regular intervals to sort of assess how well a student has learned the specific skills that are taught in that intervention. So, for example, um, if you're familiar with the with UFly Foundations, the phonics curriculum, you know that every week there's a spelling assessment in which students spell words that contain the patterns that were taught that week, and that integrate previously taught patterns. It's a way of measuring the specific sub skills that are taught in an intervention. There's lots of other programs intervention curricula out there that will, they'll have a mastery test every 10 lessons or every 15 lessons that will cumulatively assess what those previous 10 or 15 lessons actually taught the student. Both of them are they're not exactly the same. General outcome measures have to do with this overall, does this is the student uh, lessening their overall level of risk um, in response to intervention, and a mastery measure tells us, has the student learned these specific skills that we taught. And many good intervention curricula will provide guidance for, well, for if a student doesn't do so hot on these mastery measures, we need to go back and reteach lessons 2, 5, and 7, for example. So We administer general outcome measures or ongoing progress monitoring every 1 to 4 weeks, depending on the tier of intervention. So if a student is receiving tier two intervention, it might be every 2 to 4 week, 2, 3, or 4 weeks, we might monitor their progress. And if they're in tier three intensive intervention, or if you're monitoring progress through an IEP, it might be every 1 to 2 weeks. The nice thing about general outcome measures like DIBELS, oral reading fluency, or Acadian's oral reading fluency, is that they take just 1 minute, generally, most of them. Uh, you know, a um, an oral reading fluency assessment it's one of the most powerful little assessments. It tells us so much in such little time about how a student is responding, where they're headed, uh, in terms of their literacy intervention. Um, the oral reading fluency in particular, if you're older than first grade, is such a good indicator of general reading proficiency. It doesn't sound like it should be that powerful when we just have a student read a passage for 1 minute, and we track how many words correct per minute they're able to read, and the percentage of accuracy of words. But if you're a second or third grader, there's such a high correlation between how you're performing in oral reading fluency and your comprehension, that it's almost the same thing. So uh, forgive me for talking a little bit about statistics here for a second, but correlation it talks about the relationship between two variables. So it is raining outside and it is wet on the ground has a perfect correlation. It's a correlation of one, right? So there's every time, every time it's raining, it's going to be wet on the ground. Oral reading fluency has a correlation with end of year reading comprehension, in some grades as high as like 0.94, which is about as high of a correlation as you can get. So oftentimes we're asked about what are really good measures of reading comprehension? How do we track reading comprehension over time other than these sort of curriculum specific, formative or summative assessments? Like, how do we know a student is making gains in their reading comprehension? And if you're an elementary school, uh, despite it being a little bit counterintuitive, oral reading fluency is an excellent way to really understand a student's general reading skill, because your ability to fluently read, a passage samples all of these super important skills like your reading accuracy, your reading rate. Faster is not necessarily better at a certain point. And we don't want to be speed reading, but if you can read at a reasonable rate, it's pretty, and you can read with good expression. You're attending to what you read, you're understanding what you're reading as you're reading it, even though you're not necessarily isolating reading comprehension. So general outcome measures and for use of progress monitoring can be super, super helpful. Uh, and so mastery measures, again, when we do them, they're built into specific intervention curriculum according to whoever wrote the curriculum themselves. Sometimes they're every 10 lessons, sometimes they're every five, sometimes they're every 15 lessons. So the questions that progress monitoring assessments can answer, uh, is the intervention that we are implementing leading to accelerated growth in the student? Are they reliably reducing that risk for reading failure? That is the key important question that we want to know about students receiving intervention. But then from a systems level, um, examining our progress monitoring data, aggregating it from a school leadership perspective, understanding the proportion of students who are in tier two and tier three intervention who are making progress, who are reducing their risk, or who are not, tells us a lot about how effective our tier two and our tier three system actually is. Are we consistently using the right interventions? Is there like it spurs the absolutely necessary conversation from a leadership perspective of whether or not our tier two and tier three interventions are having the intended effect of of accelerating our students back to grade level proficiency. And if about 75% of students in who are in tier two and tier three interventions in your school, in your grade, in your class are not making really strong accelerated progress, your first assumption and course of action should be to examine the how we are providing that intervention, what curriculum you're using, whether it's the right intervention, whether that intervention is being done with fidelity or according to how it should be implemented and how it was implemented in research, rather than saying, oh, looking more at us at student factors and thinking, well, 75% of your students in intervention are not, they're not reading disabled. It's just not that high in of a prevalence rate in the population. Um, we work with schools and districts where, for example, they may have an intervention that's evidence-based, super strong, good for the students, and in research studies led to really strong effects for for K-5 students. The intervention itself takes, say, 30 minutes to administer the five steps of the lesson. And then in talking with us with the leadership, they have a 20-minute intervention window. And so, the first question is, well, we have kids, every single student in that 20-minute intervention window is not getting a third of the intervention. So 33% of the instruction they are automatically missing because our intervention window is too short for the intervention that we have chosen. And so it's no surprise that 80, 90% of the students who are getting that intervention are not making satisfactory growth. And so, you could either look at changing your master schedule to allow for 30 minutes, looking at an intervention that's shorter in scope, and or shorter in length. There's all sorts of ways to problem solve around what we would consider an unhealthy tier two or tier three system. Okay. We'll go a little bit more quickly through these. Some common mistakes that we see, using end of unit comprehension tests as like general outcome measures. So um, when we think about summative classroom tests, like an end of unit a test, they just don't, they're not sensitive enough to growth to inform quick, tier two or tier three decisions. So you may have students who score a 70%, then a 90%, then a 40%, then a 80%. And there's more variation in the test scores that are due to those test scores actually measuring totally different things, rather than it being a lack of progress on a student, on the student factor. So the end of unit test one might be assessing inferencing and point and author's perspective. An end of unit test two is assessing a totally different skill. And end of unit three is assessing a totally different skill. Um, and when you're using progress monitoring assessments, you want to make sure that each assessment that you're doing is measuring mostly the same thing. When you look at an oral reading fluency, but those 1 minute oral reading fluency, dibbles or cadence probes, they're all roughly equal in difficulty. The student is doing the same thing each time. They're reading for a minute. You're marking for their accuracy and their rate. Those sorts of general outcome measures, GOM, are what we want to use when we're making high stakes decisions about a student's response to intervention, like who needs to move up to tier three, who can move from tier two to tier one, and certainly, one of the highest stakes decisions about whether we need to assess a student for special education or their eligibility for special education. And that's not to say that end of unit comprehension tests aren't useful data. They certainly are, but they're probably the least reliable, and that's kids' performance tends to be kind of all over the place. Um, we also want to be reviewing grade level progress monitoring data as a team. Systems matter a lot, and uh, sometimes we see, individual teachers who are responsible for collecting, monitoring, interpreting, and making decisions all by themselves. And intervention is a team sport. MTSS is a team sport, um, because you know, these are often systems level issues, and leadership teams should be involved and analyzing why interventions are or are not reliably improving students. Um, we also don't want to use leveled reading levels to measure growth. Um, there are a lot of different reasons why that's the case. But there is tons and tons of overlap between consecutive levels. So a level M text and a level N text may not actually be that much different from one another. And a level M or a level M text may actually be more difficult than a level N for some students. And so if we assess a student as moving from an M to an N, that may not actually mean anything depending on how we um, on the books that we choose, or the types of decisions that we make based on that growth or lack thereof. We don't see a lot of schools doing this anymore about, building in, you need by the end of kindergarten, you need to be at a level D, and by the end of first grade, you need to be at a level, whatever it is. We have largely moved away from that as a state, at least on our comprehensive reading plans, which we would say is a good thing. Um, Similar to screening, we want to be in the business of progress monitoring closely English language learners. So because evidence-based instruction works well for English language learners, we want to be and assessment works, we want to be monitoring them on the same schedules as their monolingual peers. Oral reading fluency is a great indicator of general reading skill, whether you're an English language learner or English is your first language, for example. All right. Uh, let's go to we're coming to the end as our last pause and predict. So we have Lila, who's a third grader. She's been in tier two reading intervention, and her teacher has been using oral reading fluency assessments to monitor her progress every week. And so this is Lila's intervention graph. And so we have the blue line, which are her weekly oral reading fluency scores. So you see in week one, she was reading at a rate of about 30 words per minute. Then at week 12, at the end of that graph, she was somewhere a little bit below seven, or a little bit above 60 words correct per minute. The aim line is her goal line. So we want for her to be, we've set a goal for her to be reading at a little bit above 70 words per minute there, and that aim line tracks the progress that we would expect to see if she were responding, at an accelerated rate. So we want to know how should the team respond to this? Um, A, continue the current intervention as is. She's showing steady growth and just needs a little bit more time. B, we're going to exit Lila from intervention. She's making consistent progress and is no longer at risk. C, we want to check intervention fidelity and consider how to intensify. Lila is improving, but not enough to close the gap with her grade level peers, as represented by the aim line. And D, refer Lila for a special education evaluation because the intervention simply is not working. Take a moment. The answer there is C. Um, She is improving. She has definitely increased her reading rate. But we see this gap between Lila's scores and the aim line. That gap is not narrowing, right? It's not getting wider. Her improvement is certainly not nothing. She has effectively doubled her reading rate. But if we extend those lines, if we extrapolate that data, there will never come a point where Lila is meeting her goal. So she is making some improvement, but we need to do something like either intensify her intervention if she's getting it as as planned, or look at fidelity. Maybe there's something, maybe there's a piece to the intervention that is not being implemented or not being implemented consistently. Maybe she's late, she's 5 minutes late half the time and is missing a piece of the intervention, something like that uh, that we need to do to intensify her intervention because she's just not going to be able to meet that goal. So we're not totally unhappy with what's going on with Lila, but we need to make some kind of tweak. And this type of data-based decision making is really best done as a team, as a grade level team, as or a teacher in conjunction with a literacy leadership or school-based leadership team. um, Many heads are always are better than one, because we know from research that um, teachers generally do not get the necessary level of database decision making training in their teacher training programs, particularly for how to interpret progress monitoring data and make instructional decisions in response to kids who are needing intervention. Uh, and this is exactly where database decision making is super important. Um, if this, uh, yes, we're coming to the end of our time here. We'll end with outcome measures or summative measures. These are broad indicators of achievement at the end of major instructional units. Um, They are generally designed for system level evaluation, meaning looking at how effective our instructional systems are, not to guide specific individual, instructional decisions. They happen at the end of the year or at end of semester or end of unit and can be on things like FAST or end of course data or final unit assessments. So the questions that it can answer are which students are or are not mastering grade level standards, and is our curriculum and instruction working to get students to master standards across classrooms and subgroups and schools if you're at a district level. So there is some overlap here in terms of the questions that it answers with screening data, in that it is looking at the effectiveness of our systems of instruction. So again, summative data like screening data, though, it cannot tell you exactly why a student didn't master a standard or what you need to teach on Monday. Again, there's too many variables that and too many ways that we assess mastery of standards um, to really get at the level of specific instructional skills measurement that we need to drive our intervention. So, putting it all together here, we have a summary slide here that we'll end with. I know we're a bit over time. Um, if the question is about who is at risk and may need intervention, we look at our screening data. And when we're looking at the health of our tier one instructional system, our curriculum, our instruction, how we are implementing it, screening data is the data we look at. Diagnostic data tells us what skills I should target in intervention and how you group students for small and regroup students for small group instruction. Progress monitoring data, both in terms of our general outcome measures and our mastery measures, tell us how students are responding to intervention that we're providing over time, our temperature checks, and it also tells us from a systems perspective about the health of our intervention system, because about 75% of students should be reliably getting better, being accelerated in their literacy outcomes in response to intensive intervention. And then uh, our students, classes, whole schools meeting broad standards. We look at the proportion of students who are who are taking outcome and summative measures. So I know we are over time here. Oops. So I thank you for your time. Oops. Yeah, current slide. Um, We thank everyone for your time. If you have questions about this, if you are looking, if you want more information, we have many ways to provide professional learning to you around assessment and database decision making. To your school, to your district. We will be rolling out a series of new professional learning sessions in the fall. We have an excellent new one called that we're calling Literacy Lab, where we spend quite a bit of time digging into your specific data, looking at progress monitoring data, training folks on how to make these sorts of key instructional decisions. This is, an hour is not even close to enough to really do anything other than scratch the surface and kind of reveal the sorts of concepts that are involved in assessment and database decision making. So go ahead and all, we're always wanting to hear from the folks that we work with or the folks that we don't work with about what is needed there, what kind of questions you're grappling with, because we're always looking for new subjects to provide these sorts of free technical assistance webinars, or to partner directly with school districts. So thank you so much. We really appreciate your time, and have a great rest of your May and have a great summer. Thank you.